Okay, I think I'm getting the go-ahead. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a treat to see so many people here in the Picker Room at the library. I'm Julia. I'm the programs director here. Why we're here tonight is in partnership with Finding Our Voices, a Maine-based nonprofit founded and led by survivors of domestic abuse, and they do so much great work in this field, so I'm really pleased to have them back. Now I'll turn it over to Patricia McLean, who is the founder and CEO of Finding Our Voices. She'll tell us a little bit more about this and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Julia.
Now I'll have to hobble back.
Thank you, Julia, and the Camden Public Library. I stood here in 2019 on Valentine's Day, which was the launch of Finding Our Voices. It was a photo exhibit of 14 survivors, my photo portraits of them. And I had a piece of paper for my speech. It was the first time speaking publicly. And I read it, and I started to feel increasingly nauseous. And I literally said the last word, and I ran to the back, and I was sick. So I do feel for the gentleman here. The bathroom's right there. But how this came about was just the past while, more and more men have been coming up to me and telling me that my father was violent, my father was abusive. A lot of times they'll say, my mother was a victim of domestic abuse. And then one man said to me, my father beat up my mother all the time. And it's interesting that all of us boys married strong women who weren't like my mother. And he said that to me knowing that I have been through domestic abuse, but it's just people don't understand. And so more and more people, more and more men saying that to me, I was like, we have to pull something together and we have to start talking about this, especially with men. Like they talk about it, I'm sure, less than women would. And so I knew Jory from, Jory had mentioned to me, I don't know if Jory remembers this, but he mentioned to me maybe 2 or 3 years ago after we'd had the first Finding Our Voices thing, about that he had a violent father, and that always stuck in my mind. And so I said, I'm gonna call him, and I called Jory, and I said, Jory, this is what I'm thinking about. He said, I'm in. And then Scott, who has been a wonderful supporter of Finding Our Voices and reached out and told me how much he likes what we're doing, and he had mentioned the same thing to me, and I called him, and before I even finished, he said, I'm there. And then Dana has been another, stepped up to be a supporter, volunteer of ours. He's helped take our posters around Biddeford. And I sat with him actually at the Camden Deli, and he said, well, my father wasn't, he said he wasn't abusive, he was emotional. And then I called Dana, and at first I don't know if he really wanted to do it, but I had him, think about it, and here he is. John has been, John was our first board member, John Wilson. And I thought immediately of asking John to facilitate this because he'll tell you a little more, but part of the work that he does is facilitating dialogue. But just to backtrack just to tell you a little bit about Finding Our Voices, we did start off as a photo exhibit, and the photo exhibit started touring. It was in Camden, then it was at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center for 4 months in 2019. At that point, there were my photo portraits of 20 survivors. And then we were just going here, there, and everywhere. And then 2020, we were booked into the Boston Public Library, actually. We were in Connecticut, we were just everywhere. COVID. So everything stopped. And I was like, well, the problem's only going to get worse, so we have to think of something. So the indoor exhibits didn't work anymore. These have got to, I was like, this has got to be outside in the windows so that people, if they're only going to the hospital or they're only going to the grocery store, it's hard to remember that was the case at one time, they will see these posters. So it turned into a poster campaign. And then it was posters, and 90 cities they've been in Maine, and a lot are still up. And then what happened was the posters, then now we have 45 women on them, including our governor. But the posters had our website, and more women were getting in touch with us through the posters and letting us know about the serious gaps in Maine and in the system for survivors of domestic abuse. As far as money, there's no money out there. Even like programs, and just women feel alone. And so we have the wonderful domestic abuse agencies, and we're supplementing what they're doing with a different approach and just different programs. So now what we do, we became a nonprofit a couple of years ago, and our mission is to mitigate the three things that most trap women and children in domestic abuse. And those are stigma and shame. That's with the posters and these talks. And then there's the isolation. And what we do there is we have healing retreats. We have a community of survivors. And we have online support groups. And then there's the financial abuse, because financial abuse is in pretty much every case of domestic abuse. And to mitigate that, we have a Get Out, Stay Out fund. And this year so far, we've paid out about $70,000 for legal, shelter, car, and food costs, and security systems. We have women calling us, and this woman just last week, her ex is going to be released from prison after almost killing her, and with a record that's as long as this room. And he bashed in her door before he left for prison. She doesn't have a door. And the DA, no one's stepping up to give her a door. So we paid for a door, and for her to get it Monday when she asked for it Saturday. People call and they need security systems. The DAs are releasing these homicidal maniacs who are gunning for these women, and they're not calling the women in to say, sorry, we have to give them, early release, good behavior, whatever, plea deal. What can we do to keep you safe? No, they're just releasing. And a lot of times they don't even notify the victim. So these are the kind of things that we're stepping up to help to do. So I just want to sort of wrap this up by saying that we really could use volunteers, and we have specific things we could use volunteers for. I really need someone to come to my house and help me put my Finding Our Voices scrapbook together. We've got part 1 and part 2. It's like piled up on my desk. That's one project. Organize files, just make calls for us, help us get flyers out when we're doing events. There's lots of different things that people could do. So if you're at all interested in volunteering, please get in touch. And also year-end giving, please think about Finding Our Voices. And I would like to introduce my good friend, Mary Lou, who's driven from Scarborough. Mary Lou facilitates our online support group sometimes, and then she also facilitates my book club, online book club, and we do a lot of things together. And we have had a lot of talks about our children and challenges because of the domestic abuse. And it was hard. My family was blown to bits when my ex was arrested, and it took a lot of. It was hard, and we are wonderful now. But there was a time that I didn't know if we would be talking. It's horrible to say, but things were really hard, and it took a lot, therapy and different things. But that's what happens a lot of times. So Mary Lou has something to say, and then after that, we're going to turn it over to the men. But I wanted to welcome my good friend Mary Lou, my sister.
Okay. Wow, I think we break the record today with attendance. Thank you, and I'm here as a survivor and a mother that lived in a domestic abuse situation, and I do better when I read, so I'll try to keep it. It's only 3 minutes. So on August 21st, 2005, I left my 43-year abusive marriage at the age of 65. As I pulled out of the driveway and the garage door closed, it was the first day I began to respect myself. Even though I was crying and even though I was depressed, I haven't ever looked back since that day. As a mother of 4 children, 1 daughter and 3 sons, that lived in our dysfunctional and abusive house, I never knew or understood that we were victims of domestic abuse. I struggled daily to maintain the status quo, and I believed if I prayed hard enough and did things differently, we would live happily ever after. Never realizing the danger we were living in, 24/7, 365, with my abuser who had guns. I truly believed that I did the best I could at that time. I would love to give the answer to why I stayed and did not protect my children from their father's sociopathic and narcissistic behavior. I lived in a daze of fear to protect us from the power and control of my ex-husband had over each of us. No one knew. No one knew. That the daily hell on earth we lived, not even our families and friends. It was about protecting his good name. He was a college professor who was respected by his colleagues and community, and he was an evil monster when the doors of our house were locked. I lost my soul in the process and was ready to end my life to stop the pain of his abuse. Praise God, I chose life on August 20th, 2005. Each of my children have deep scars from living with their father's abuse. My only daughter died by suicide at age 51. One son doesn't talk to me. Another is a motivational speaker in California who shares his story to help others. I live with radical acceptance. My youngest son, Billy, and his wife, Sarah, live close by. They embrace me and love me, just the way I am. I'm very close to my daughter's daughters, Megan and Annie, and their spouses who live in Portland. I'm blessed and grateful to have all of them in my life. The men on our panel tonight will share their stories of living with abusive fathers. The ripple effect of domestic abuse touches everyone in the family and beyond. I have tears in my eyes as I write. They are tears of hope. Hope for that the Sisterhood of Finding Our Voices, who works tirelessly to bring the message of breaking the silence of domestic abuse, and to the audience who will leave informed and enlightened of the horrors of domestic abuse that will be shared tonight, and to pray for those being abused as I speak right now. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, John. I'm going to turn it over to the men now.
Okay. So I'm John Wilson. Those of you who know me from Wooden Boat will wonder what the hell I'm doing here, talking about victims and survivors and domestic violence. The kind of abusive home that I grew up in was not the active abusive home that these men will describe. And I'm not here to talk about the abuse that occurred in my home when I was growing up. I'm here to help encourage them to tell what they want to tell and help encourage you to participate in the conversation, because that's what we want to happen tonight, a conversation, because they'll tell their stories, but they're counting on having a conversation in this community. I'm so impressed with the turnout here. This is really amazing. Plus, I'm envious. We have this tiny little library in Brooklyn, which is really great and really heartfelt, but this is beautiful. It's just amazing. So thank you, Camden, and thank you, Camden Library, and thank you, Julia, and thank you, Patricia. So I'm 24 years ago now, I got involved in working with victims of violent crime who wanted to meet and talk with their usually incarcerated offenders. And what I learned from that work was how much victims and survivors are not heard, how much they are silenced, even by people who don't want them silenced. It's very hard for most of us to listen to the kinds of stories that direct survivors of violence and violation have to tell. And they feel sort of trapped in those stories. So when I think about what Patricia has unleashed here in helping survivors, first finding our own voice, then helping survivors find their voices. I mean, there are poster girls here. And I mean, it's amazing what has happened in the wake of Patricia's radicalization, coming out of that pain. And it's a real honor for me to be to have been working with her on this project as part of the board of Finding Our Voices. But this is like what I love most to do, help survivors be heard. And tonight that's what we're going to do. And they will, these men, brave men, will introduce themselves and tell something of their stories. And then I'll ask them a couple of questions and then we'll open it up. But I want to tell you something. You know, Mary Lou talked about the sociopathy here among these kinds of offenders. So I've worked for 24 years with offenders in the worst kinds of crimes because their victims and survivors want to talk with them about those crimes. Basically, their victims want them to explain themselves. How could you do this? How could you do this to me or to my loved one? Explain yourself. That's what they want. So I've worked with murderers, not serial murderers, but murderers, with serial rapists, with attempted murderers, with domestic abusers, with child sexual abuse offenders, predators, all in the interest of helping prepare those offenders for the survivors to give voice to what it is that they want to give voice to about what happened, because they want to know why, they want to know how, they want to know how did you become capable of this? So in all the different crime types I've worked with the offenders in service to the victims, it shocks me still to be able to have to report to you that domestic violence offenders are the hardest population of offenders to work with. Serial rapists understand that they've done something wrong. They usually don't care that they've done something wrong, but they know they've done something wrong. Criminal pedophiles know that they've done something wrong. They often don't care, but they know that they've done something wrong. Murderers, the ones who make volitional choices to murder someone, know that they've done something wrong. I could go on in all different crime types. Domestic abusers don't actually believe that they did something wrong in 90% of the cases, except for the fact that they got sentenced to a prison sentence. They're thinking like, it's horrible to have to say this, but these are the kinds of things they think. She deserved this. If she hadn't done this, I wouldn't have done what I did. I mean, it's incomprehensible to sit with someone who does this, who thinks like this, and realize they honestly do not believe they've done anything wrong. And that is what we have to change. And it has just been an incredible privilege for me to get close enough with these men to be able to listen to their stories. And, I'm still going to be amazed, I know. So what I'm going to do is they're going to speak. They know the order. They're in the order they're going to speak in. My God, you've sat in the right order. And they're going to speak. And then I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. But I'll let you introduce yourself and tell your story, all right?
All right. Great. Thanks, John.
You're welcome.
I've done a lot of public speaking in my life. I've run 3 national organizations. I've testified before Congress. I've spoken at rallies of 35,000 people. I'm nervous. And yet, I'm coming on my retirement my beginning of my retirement on the 1st of January, after a lifetime in the environmental movement. And suddenly, I'm here.
Scott, tell us who you are.
I will.
Okay.
I will. I will.
My bad.
Thank you. Sometimes I forget. I'm Scott Denman, and I live in Belmont on Tilden Pond with my wonderful wife, Wendy, and a little wee Norfolk Terrier, Toby. But before I get started, I want to bring it down home real and now. Last night in Searsmont, just down the road from us, a guy who was known to be abusive, a wife who had left the house to get away from him, came back to get something. He shot her and killed her, and then he shot himself. Domestic abuse is happening everywhere, every day. We hope that we can end it. I was born and I lived the first 13 years of my life on Cape Cod with my mother Lucille, my father Nathaniel, and my 6 sibs, 2 older brothers and 4 younger sisters. My father was diagnosed as manic depressive and bipolar. He himself was raised by an alcoholic philanderer who considered my dad the black sheep of his family with 4 children. Dad's mother had no concept how to care for children, so he was raised mostly by his grandmother and his aunt. Being a member of Mensa attests to my dad's brilliance, that he perpetrated violence and emotional terror on his wife and family attests to his severely stunted emotional capacity. Dad's inability to cope with his own childhood trauma perpetuated the abuse cycle. My mother was the last and late-in-life child of her beloved father from Blair, Ohio, and stoic mother. Intellectually bright, Mom earned a graduate degree from Yale School of Nursing. On the dark side, however, her brother fondled her in her early teens, a dark secret until late in life. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, my father's physics consulting business was growing but highly stressful. His consultants built the mid-course correction system for the Apollo mission. My dad worked at home. My mom did as well, raising the 7 of us. Another huge stress was the construction of a Main Street bypass right through our backyard in Falmouth, Massachusetts. My childhood memories are haunted by violence and a relentless emotional hurricane. According to the court documents, my father would shake me and hit me to stop crying when I was a baby getting my diapers changed. My mother apparently pounded on his back, unable to stop him. I don't cognitively remember that, but spent 20 years plus in therapy to understand, to accept, and to grow out from under the control underneath the childhood trauma shadow. Dinner time around with the 9 of us around the oval kitchen table often devolved into a screaming rant from my father and my mom being hit. One time, all of us crying and panicked, Dad pushed food in her face and flung a full gallon of relish all around the kitchen. He then took a glass pitcher full of milk, poured it on her, suspending that glass empty pitcher above her in a terrifying threat to smash it on her head. Dad would hit and beat Mom if she scuffed her feet, made errors on business papers, or if she talked back. Enraged, my dad once made my mom smash her extensive and loved jazz record collection. During the war, she served as a Navy nurse in New York and got to go to hear Bix Butterby and Benny Goodman and all of those greats. I returned from grade school one day to find doctors, police, and other strangers in our house. Mom fell down the stairs and is in the hospital, Dad said. Much later, I learned that Dad had kicked Mom in the gut with his boot on and ruptured her spleen. She came within 15 minutes of dying, according to the doctors. During my dad's rants and violence to Mom, my brother Burke and I would listen through the heat vent upstairs in the bathroom. And we would lie there plotting, if we only had a gun, we would kill him. We boys were subject to beating for the slightest of provocation. As I think is probably the case with bipolar folks, he would wake up whistling, and I knew that was going to be a hellish day. Once, my mother went to Ohio to see her family. She brought me back on my birthday a beautiful, gigantic, rich blue Tonka truck. A couple of weeks later, Burke and I were tossing rocks into an old beat-up truck in the backyard because we loved the new blue one so much. We were kids. My dad saw us and promptly smashed my amazing truck. I later learned that Dad had only one toy as a child, an old, rusty pedal truck. Literally at her wit's end in 1963, my desperate mother hit Dad in the head with a hammer while he slept. He didn't die, but in a miracle of social services, he was the one to be sent to a psychiatric hospital for 2-week evaluation. Finally, in 1964, my mother, by then a frail, withered waif, broke through her own inertia and the prevailing social stigma against divorce. She beseeched my father for rest in Ohio, her family's home. For some inexplicable miracle, my dad let her go. She left for Ohio with Burke and the 4 girls. I was kept behind as a pawn to ensure she returned. Burke went with him because my dad despised him. As he had been the black sheep in his family, he had turned Burke into the black sheep in our family. Then in high school, my oldest brother, Mark, did not want to go to Ohio. That desperately sad summer day, I watched my mom and my 5 sibs drive away, leaving me behind. Looking back now, I believe I literally abandoned myself at that moment. In my mind, I thought, of course I can't go too. I'm just not worthy. I soon became anemic. I gained weight. I became addicted to sugar and lived in a made-up fantasy world, constantly daydreaming about refighting World War II battles against the Nazis, fighting and heroically killing Nazis and bad guys, sustaining horrific imaginary wounds. In my fantasy, I would linger at death's door while the whole country and the president paid for my recovery. I was in a serious fantasy world. For 2 years, between the ages of 11 and 13, I lived in the gulag with my dad and my oldest brother. I was beaten for absurd things like wearing ripped pants in public. My dad never bought me any clothes, nor did he ensure that I brushed my teeth, washed my hair, or anything of that kind of hygienic care. In 1966, my mom finally got custody of me after a dramatic 2 years long court battle. My father's lawyer was F. Lee Bailey. Once away from my father, I immediately began to grow into my healthy self and stretch my wings. Mom raised us 6 kids without any child support or alimony funds. Dad simply refused to pay. In Ohio, I acted out my rage using vandalism. I wasn't beaten. I was denigrated. I wasn't denigrated, but my mom made sure I apologized and made amends. I learned my actions were my responsibility and that there were real-life consequences for harming others and things. In high school in 1970, I had an epiphany of sorts in the deep woods, and for a lack of better description, I fell in love with Mother Earth. In doing so, I became committed to something bigger than myself. I think it saved me. In my senior year of high school, I started organizing after Earth Day 1970 to protect the environment. In 1971, I worked with Ralph Nader and testified in the US Congress for the first time at the age of 18 to help stop the strip mining of the Hopi and Navajo Indian lands. Since 1982, I've run 3 national environmental organizations. The metaphor is obvious. I spent my career protecting Mother Earth against the corporate patriarchy. Years of therapy has helped to truly take care of myself and therefore others. I'm grateful for peeling back the layers of the trauma onion and discovering and accepting who I really am and beginning to love myself. I know I'm going a little long here, so excuse me. The long-term effect of childhood trauma has created various difficulties. I've tended to put women on pedestals, and it took a couple of days before I could even argue with any woman. But women are not complete saints, and men are not complete devils, as imprinted by my childhood and early teen years. I am grateful for my loving and non-enabling wife. She's done her own spiritual work and psychological work, and she doesn't try to fix me, she doesn't try to change me, or take on any of my crap. In being true to herself and her own sovereignty, when I'm irrational, I have no one to blame and nowhere to look except into the mirror, and then take an adult responsibility for my own feelings and the antecedents of my angers, frustration, and resentments. I'm grateful for the Great Spirit's gift of forgiveness and the capacity to heal. I eventually forgave my father for his cruelty and my mother for the very complicated issue of abandonment. It has taken me much, much longer to forgive and truly, honestly nurture myself. That is a present and daily task. At this point in my life, I've had the good fortune to work for the health of the planet with incredible people based on deep mutual values, speaking truth to power, and taking positive action in a collaborative, open spirit. With the grace of the higher power and many, many wonderful souls, I stand here today to end domestic violence and abuse. To those who experience abuse, I am your brother. We can learn to survive and thrive and then break the cycle. Together we can and we will achieve the vision of safe, loving families, thriving in peace, justice, and healthy collaboration. And I thank you all for being here. Woo.
This is a picture of my dad and myself. I was 15 and he was 45, and we just finished 2 years of him coaching me to become an Eagle Scout, as he was 30 years earlier. I'll pass this around. As I look closely, I can see a tenderness in my dad. Here he is, the skill giver, a job that he took very, very seriously. He's very insistent skill giver. From the beginning, I did projects with my dad, and he made me into the almost compulsive engineer that I am now. You've probably seen me driving my contraptions around town. And I'm not going to talk about the first section of my talk, which is to take you back to some of the incidents of my growing up. It's hard not to do that because they make such good stories, but I think we've already heard some wonderful immersions in that horror, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just will mention, in passing, 3 incidents that were formative in my growing up.
Do we know who you are?
Pardon? Oh, I'm Jory Squibb. I'm from Camden for about 40 or 50 years, and I'm a retired boat captain and an inventor. I'd like to take you back when I was 6 years old, and my big sister was 8 years old, and my 2 other sisters were 2 and 4 years old, and we were sitting in the back of our 1941 green Mercury convertible, waiting for our Sunday picnic, and which we did every Sunday. We took a drive and had a picnic. And my parents came from the house and sat in the front, and there was obviously an argument going on, and we heard some mumbles up there. And then we heard this slap, resounding slap. And my mother went into the house and crying, and my dad followed, and my two younger sisters burst into tears, just absolute wailing tears. And I turned to my 8-year-old big sister, and she said, "Dad is spanking Mama the same way he spanks us. She's done something wrong." And kind of made sense in some weird way, but on a very deep level, it didn't make sense. On a very deep level, my sisters were telling me the truth. Their wail was telling me the truth. That the foundations were shifting, things were different. Fast forward 2 more years, we'd moved to Michigan from Cincinnati. My dad and mom were entertaining his new boss and his boss's wife, and we were supposed to come down and meet the company before we went to bed, and I didn't do it. I was very shy. My dad came stomping up the stairs after the company had left and swung and hit me in the mouth and broke a tooth, and blood was all over, and stomped downstairs, and my mother came up and helped me get cleaned up and get into bed. And my mother was completely silent. Completely silent. Just add that to abuse is sometimes different than doing something. Sometimes it's not doing something. Fast forward again, I'm 17 years old. My dad has worked with me to build my first car out of other older cars, and I've gotten my freedom. I've run away from home and come back, and I'm soon to leave for college. And again, I disobey my dad, so I'm more aware of my needs now, and I have more freedom. My dad hears about it. It's a secret, and he grabs a hammer and chases me around our neighborhood. Asks my friends where I am. Finally traps me in a garage. I hear the door slam of the garage. And I'm in the garage with this man with a hammer. And I completely agree that I will never do this thing again. And he calms down and stomps out of the garage. I sit on the pile of wood and shake. I didn't mean to tell you these stories, but because you're going to hear so many of them. But went off to college, glad that 900 miles were going to separate me from my dad. And if you asked me then about my childhood, I would tell you how wonderful it was. This is the second part of my story, is forgetting. I would tell you how wonderful, how provident, that sent to the best schools, now being sent east to the Ivy League. That was a story that I had in my forebrain. And I was a whiz kid in college, doing engineering as my dad had insisted. And when I stepped out from college into the wide world, it became very clear that I was a damaged person, that I was a dysfunctional person, in spite of all that providence. Joined the Peace Corps, fired from the Peace Corps. It was clear that I could not work in any kind of a bureaucracy or any kind of a power structure. But almost immediately, I would make any leaders uneasy. Had a wonderful first romance, 3 or 4 years long, very stormy, very wonderful. Called off by her just before the wedding. And what she said to me is interesting. She said, "Jory, you are so much fun. You are The times when it's been good with you have just been so wonderful. But when you get close, when there's real intimacy, or the possibility of intimacy, you will start to backpedal. You will start to blame. You will start to get sarcastic. You will use that great intellect of yours to create distance. And I can't stand it anymore. And here's your ring. And we're calling off this wedding. And don't come and pursue me. Because I know you're going to turn on your charm the way you always have. But it won't work anymore. I'm out of here. So I thought I didn't hear that, but I heard that. And from that point on, relationships were even more distant. I didn't take risks in relationship. Got another, later on, a wonderful job, fired. Again, an impulsive, cowboy-like decision, sudden, that was bound to create the distance that I needed. It was bound to get me out of that school, even though it was a wonderful school and a wonderful job. Finally, at 40, I was desperate to start a family, and I married and had a child, wonderful child, and was separated after a year. The pattern hadn't changed, and got involved in a custody battle about the child. And I want you to hear me at this point. I decided to abscond with my son and go to another country. I got him a passport. And the time clicked down to my disappearance with him. And all of a sudden, 2 dots in my life came together. All of a sudden, I realized that my father was not 900 miles away. This is exactly the decision that he would have made in this situation when a situation got totally out of his control. He would have done something abrupt, not caring about suffering, sudden. That's exactly what my father would have done, is take my son abroad. And that was the end. I couldn't distance myself from my father anymore because my father was inside me. He was inside me. I called Mid-Coast Mental Health. I got a good counselor up in Belfast. And for the next 2 years, I sat in that office. And a new voice emerged that I had never heard before. A different voice came out of my mouth and out of my spirit. A nasty voice, an angry voice, a voice that you don't hear in the Midwest because it's trained out of you. You're not allowed to say those sorts of things, those ungrateful things. And my counselor said, bring your parents into this office. And so they flew from Michigan, and they sat there like 2 stones. 2 stones, doing something that was not done in Michigan in the 50s, where before, in front of a stranger, you speak like this. And they went back to Michigan, and my mother started writing me letters, if I promised never to show them to my father. And her, I began to understand her. From that time, after those 2 years, I remarried, had 2 daughters. And I know you want a happy ever after story coming here, and it's not there. The pattern was still there, but it lost its power, some of its power. There was now a kind of awareness that the pattern would come up periodically. I was helped by my wife's calling me by my dad's name. My name is George, my dad's name is George, my grandfather and great-grandfather, all Georges. But I use the name Jory as a way of distancing myself from my dad. And my wife would sometimes say, "Okay, George." That pattern was still there. So the fourth part of my story is healing, but only partial healing. Because healing is not a product. It's a process. And it's never over. It's never over. But it does, suffering does diminish a little bit. And we are able to break the cycle.
I too have quite a bit of public speaking experience, and I can totally relate to Scott saying, "I'm nervous." I had planned on memorizing this for tonight, but I decided not to. It's a rather emotional subject, so I decided to read it, so please bear with me as I read it. Well, good evening. My name is Dana Ward, and although I now live in Biddeford, I was born and raised in Belfast. I also have a close connection to Camden in that I was a park ranger at Camden Hill State Park. I had a varied career, all centered around financial services, both in the nonprofit and profit-making sectors. I'm married to Paula, who is a senior tax accountant. So thank you for coming tonight to listen to our stories, as difficult as they are for our newfound friends and me to share. They are crucial in helping us break the cycle of domestic abuse and violence. I will mince no words tonight. I grew up with a father who was verbally and emotionally abusive to my mother. He passed away in 2005. Although I use the words verbally and emotionally abusive, I no longer differentiate between them, as whether domestic abuse is verbal, emotional, or physical, abuse is abuse is abuse. While physical abuse can leave scars, broken bones, and other physical injuries, verbal and emotional abuse leaves scars on the heart and mind for many years to come. It can also have physical manifestations from the stress it causes. My mom suffered from some health issues, including elevated blood pressure. I believe they were the result of the stress she experienced from my father's abuse. At one point in my teen years, she would also wake up in the middle of the night with panic attacks. I would hear my father trying to silence her, but I would later learn what was happening to her was a reactionary condition. My mom is one of the nicest, kindest, warm-hearted individuals you would ever meet. She grew up in a loving home with my grandfather and grandmother owning a successful lumber company in Belfast for over 50 years, Walker Lumber Company. At one point, it was one of the largest employers in Belfast, which is where he met my mother. My mom graduated from Huston College in the 1950s. I would often hear my father use the term college-educated fools. Not until I got older did I realize that by virtue of calling people college-educated fools, he was calling my mom a fool. One memory that is seared in my mind is one day when I was a young teen, I had done something that angered my father. I heard him yelling at my mom in the basement. He said, "I'm going to kill him." I heard her crying and then silence. If I had heard him coming up the stairs, I was ready to bolt out the door. We had a walkout basement, and all I can think is that he exited from there and went out to the garage to cool off, as he didn't come up the stairs. My mom then came up and consoled me. He took a long time to come into the house, and he never said a word about that after that. No apology, nothing. The silence was deafening. Thankfully, he had never did that again to me, but I was always on guard after that to try not to do anything that might anger him. Here it is, over 40 years later, and I have to keep telling my younger self that he didn't have any intention of killing me. Rather, I have to believe, as it's too hard to accept the alternative, he said it just to be another form of verbal abuse toward my mom. What better way to control a mom than for a father, stepfather, or mother's boyfriend to say that he's going to kill his child? My father would belittle my mom, say harsh things to her, and control her in various ways. She would walk on pins and needles with him, never knowing what may set him off. Before she had me, she miscarried with twins. From what I understand, she went into a depression, and understandably so. During that difficult and vulnerable time, she started attending a Baptist church in Belfast, First Baptist Church. I don't know why she left First Baptist Church, but she ended up attending a Pentecostal church. Their views are quite legalistic. They believe the husband is the head of the household, essentially making the wife subservient to the husband. Sadly, this emboldened my father, who was already controlling to begin with. Patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny are alive and well in those high-control, authoritarian-type churches. Is it no wonder that with such twisted teachings that my mom waited on my father like a servant? Speaking of churches, this isn't the forum to go into details about it, but I'd be remiss not to mention that I've been fighting another form of abuse for over 20 years, clergy sexual abuse. I bring this up as my work fighting clergy sexual abuse has so much in common with my fight against domestic abuse and violence. What the abusers want to keep secret and behind closed doors is being exposed to the light of day, especially thanks to social media today. Perpetrators of all types are finally being exposed, and for that, I am most grateful. Tonight, as we focus the spotlight on perpetrators of domestic abuse and violence, it is our hope that this is just the beginning of men like us stepping up to the plate and saying, enough is enough. Our personal stories of our fathers are so compelling and so very telling. We know from our personal experiences that we must walk side by side with our sisters of finding our voices. They are doing an incredible job exposing perpetrators and providing education and prevention. We also must work at helping other individuals like us men who have broken the cycle of abuse. For anyone here tonight who thinks you can't make a difference in this world, think again. We all have life stories to tell, and by using those stories as platforms from which to spring, we can make a huge positive change. Witness my brothers here, Scott, Jory, John, and my sister Patricia, along with many sister survivors, and I know there's some in this room tonight. We have indeed all found our voices. As a teen, I was both an environmentalist, Scott will appreciate that, I know, who believed strongly in protecting our environment, as well as being one who thought positively about how we can all make a difference. That was really important to me even as a kid. How can we make a difference in this world? This is the cool part. I had put some stickers on my bed headboard with positive words of encouragement to me, my younger self. One was, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. How cool to think that fast forward over 40 years later, I've been volunteering with Finding Our Voices, and to think that their color is the same color as lemons, yellow. And by the way, I didn't know this, but if you haven't seen it, there are some bracelets over there on the table. They're new, I understand. It says Break the Silence, FOV, for Finding Our Voices. Again, yellow. Speaking of yellow, I wore a yellow T-shirt when I helped putting up Finding Our Voices posters all around Biddeford and Saco last year. And again this year when we survivors and advocates stood behind Governor Janet Mills as she signed a domestic abuse-related bill into law. That was such an incredible experience to stand behind our governor. If I could only go back in time and tell my younger self how that sticker on my headboard showing a picture of lemons and with the words, "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade." Would you believe someday, Dana, you will be part of something so big and so beautiful, standing side by side with our Finding Our Voices sister survivor, Patricia, and her sister survivors, as well as for us guys on the panel. I would have known in my heart and soul that no matter how hard it was at that time, that life someday would get so much better, that life is indeed worth living. I want to thank you all for listening to our stories tonight and for helping us as we press on, making lemonade out of life's lemons. May this night be a force for change. Thank you.
You're here. It's just so amazing, you men with such courage. I mean, you are amazing. I want to ask you each, because you've really bared some pain here. And I just want to check in. Like, what is this, Scott, starting with you, what is this feeling like to be in this room with people who know you and people who don't? And say a little bit to us about what this is like for you.
Wow. It's so weird, and it's so great, and it's so wonderful, and it's so frightening, and it's everything all at once. And I mean, there's just so many miracles that are occurring right now in my life as I transition from my career. I mean, real miracles I could go on about, amazing. And I just, to have this as an opening, and to have you folks here to listen, to share with. I'm grateful.
All right, thank you, Scott. All right. Jory, same question.
Well, I've had 2 or 3 weeks of sleepless nights. It's put me through a lot to agree to this evening. As I look back, I couldn't make the changes by myself. Just, I can do this. Things only happened when I said help, and really meant it. And help meant other people, at least one, but actually a lot. Somehow this work has to be social. In my experience, it has to be public. It has to come out of isolation, because so much of what we're dealing with, what I was dealing with, is subconscious. It's covered up with minimization and denial. And as long as I'm left alone, that will tell the story. So here we are in what to me is sacred space. This is sacred space. It's a safe space. I'm surrounded by people who offer safety and have their own stories. And I can't tell you how grateful I am.
Okay, thanks. And Dana?
I have to say that What you folks don't know is leading up to tonight, we 4 guys have gotten together 4 times, and it has been an incredible experience. I've gained 3 brothers that I didn't know I have. And I want to thank Patricia for giving us this platform. It's just been an incredible experience. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the interactive part. So, please.
I have had the remarkable fortune of growing up living here in Camden, Maine, even though I've only lived here 40 years out of my 72. It's growing up here because largely and most specifically because of the men's group that I am a member of for the last 36 years, where we meet once a week or once every 2 weeks and have deep, affirming, honest conversations where I am called upon to be ruthlessly honest as much as I can be. And listening. It has taught me to listen to the stories of others. That has given me an ability to have voice. And I know because I can't tell you, probably 1,000 people or more have told me how rare it is, personally told me one-to-one, how rare it is to have, for men to have the kind of community that we have. A couple members of my men's group are in here tonight, and for that I'm very grateful. One an older member and one an older, more recent member. But anyway, for both of you, I'm glad you're here. And I know that Jory and others belong to men's groups here, which are so important. But I'm going to say just quickly that I am a survivor of rape in a school. So you spoke about clergy, but school is also a family. And I was born and raised on a campus in a family school in which my perpetrator was not blood, but was the son of the leader of the school, and there was no voice. There was none. There was no way for my parents to respond or acknowledge. There was no way for me to speak out, and it's not dissimilar. And the place of silence that was created within that, where no one could speak, is now broken. And so I have been an active member of that, and that's where I am very grateful. I'll say one thing, the most powerful thing perhaps in healing in my life was when the present school board called me and apologized on behalf of the earlier school board and my father for not having, and my parents for not having ever acknowledged what happened to me. But also my father was a violent man, not a physically violent man, but a verbally violent man, emotionally violent man, who placed my mother on a pedestal. They were such a pair that there was no place, particularly for me, who was the black sheep of the family and was despised by both my parents. And it was actively stated. So I know of situations where my father's fist was right there and it never hit my nose, but it was so threatening. And the threats that he made to others and the violence he acted on animals constantly made me realize that the animals that he loved, if he said, and he did at times as well as despising, that he loved me, how do I trust that? There are so many layers to domestic violence, whether it's in the clergy, which is a family, whether it's in the family, which is a family, whether it is in our community, whether it's towards women, whether it's towards men, whether it's from men or it's from women, because it also comes from women to men to children. And I'm sorry, was it you that said, no, who was it that said by the silence? Was it you that said by the silence? The silence is also violent and can be. So there are all kinds of ways of manifesting that in which Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you
that we
so much.
must break through. We must break through. We are breaking through.
So, who else would like to speak? Someone want to?
In this sacred space, that I'd like to ask all of you who have come here to listen to us, I would like you to raise your hands if you've experienced domestic abuse of any kind. Oh my God.
Wow.
Thank you for
Wow.
being honest, and this is what we all want to heal.
I look forward to the time when a meeting like this happens in every place.
Yeah.
And that an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 16-year-old boy could hear this and could develop the vocabulary that we're developing tonight. So it just comes out in the open. It's not secretive and not implicit, or it's right out there in the open. Thank you.
Thank you, Jory.
I could sum it up, but I want to go back to what Chris just said. And thank you, Chris. I often have not listened to my wife, and I have spoken over her. And I know because she's confronted me, and I told you that she's done her work, that is a huge disrespect to her. And so the process, I'm not going to beat myself up here, but I'm going to say that the process is daily. The process is ongoing. And so it's important that I have a practice where I'm coming back to my center and my spiritual core and listening. So it's a long cleanup process. But we're amazing, us human beings. And everybody in this room, I'm so grateful for. And all that you've gone through that I have no idea of, I'm just thankful. And we can end it. And we can thrive.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, John.